Hi, welcome to another episode 6 of the Juan and Keir podcast. We have another guest this week. This week it's our friend, or my friend Marcos, that I grew up with in Venezuela. He studied political economy of Europe specifically, and in general political economy. So he was going to actually recommended the Capital of the 21st Century book to me that I found very, very informative. And listening through that and reading other economic books, I've been interested in the concept of why nations fail and succeed. And we have books like Robinson's and Asimov's Why Nations Fail. And so I thought that's always something that people have talked about. And their theory is that it's inclusive markets versus exclusive markets, right? If you have monopolies, that's an exclusive market and something like that. And basically it's very, very studied why nations fail, because obviously you want to avoid those pitfalls. But I feel people don't consider enough why nations succeed or why they succeed. And I think one of the quotes that people say often is that success is a bad teacher, right? When you succeed, you often don't question yourself too much why you have been successful. And so in this episode, I want to get to the bottom of what makes countries successful. I want to have this discussion with you two about what your thoughts are in it. But I wanted to start with a fun exercise that I think it's fun, which is I have here written down the top 10 countries by GDP per capita.
Okay.
And you guys are going to try to guess it. I've chosen GDP per capita because even though it doesn't take into account distribution of income, it is basically the best measure for how powerful the average person is in a country, right? And so, for example, in the 1980s, the three most GDP per capita countries were all oil states like UAE, Qatar, and then were economies like the Americans and the rich European countries. And so the meta was being an oil producer back in the 1980s. Let's see if you can figure out the current meta. All right, I'm gonna go 5 answers each, and I'll say I'll give you 1 point if you name one of the 10 of the top 10.
Okay,
so,
Luxembourg.
I was thinking
okay, Luxembourg. All right, you got one.
Singapore.
Well, let's do it one after the other.
Okay.
But yeah, Singapore's also in it.
Oman?
Oman is not in it, bro.
Qatar has to still be in there.
Qatar's not in there.
Damn.
It's really close to top 10. It's 13.
Okay,
But
but we're doing the top 5 or top 10.
Each of you give 5.
Oh, okay.
So it's your turn now. I guess you'll have to do 2 in a row because he did 2 in a row.
South Korea?
Man, you suck at this. You clearly haven't figured out the meta.
No, but he has another one because I did.
You have another one.
Well, Taiwan?
No.
Well, we're entering a dangerous territory.
No.
Is it even
Right,
a
so
country?
Marcos has 2 correct and you have 0 correct.
Trying to think. But to be honest, he thought of the same 2 that I said.
That you're gonna say. Okay.
Trying to think the Liechtenstein or something like that, the small European countries.
Actually, I was gonna go for that one.
Is that one?
Liechtenstein is one of them,
yeah.
Monaco?
Monaco is number 1.
Damn, Monaco.
Right. 1 more each.
Wait, let me think. If you have another one, go for it.
No, I'm trying to think it through.
What's another one? Small. Lithuania? Something like that? No.
Lithuania's not here.
Okay. I'm discarding all of Latin America.
Correctly. I don't think we're top 30 any Latin American countries.
Is it in, just give you a clue, is it in Eurasia?
Yeah, I mean, there's still a bunch of them left. So yeah, there's
But
there's a bunch
we've
of people.
named the number 1.
You named number 1, number 2, number 4, and number 8.
Okay,
number 8
where is
Singapore.
number 3? Eurasia or...
No, it's in the Americas.
Oh shit.
Number 3 is in the Americas.
The
you
US.
You have to try to guess, Keir. It's your last guess, and then I will reveal the list.
In the Americas?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. It has to be a small country, because if it's by capita, that really skews in favor for really small populations.
Okay.
I'll give you a clue. Try to figure out the meta. The meta was oil in the 1980s. What do you think is the current meta?
Tax evasion. Seychelles?
Well, Seychelles is not in the
Cayman
list.
Islands.
Cayman Islands is 7th on the list.
Oh shit.
Alright, so the list is.
Wait, I want to guess the third.
Oh my
one.
god! But if this takes
It has the Virgin
I'll give you.
Islands.
I'll give
US Virgin Islands,
I'll give you like 20 seconds to guess, and then I'll reveal.
Some of those islands.
Oh, Panama.
It is an island. I'll say that much. It is an island.
What's another one of those tax evasion Caribbean islands? Cayman. Bahamas.
No, it's not Bahamas.
Bermuda.
Bermuda's number 3. So yeah, the official list is Monaco, Liechtenstein, Bermuda, Luxembourg, Ireland, Switzerland, Cayman Islands, Singapore, Isle of Man, and Norway.
Isle of Man.
Shout outs to Norway for being like the one non-tax evasion country. I mean, I think it's too much to say that Switzerland is just a tax evasion country, but it is one of its important industries.
Yeah.
So
it's not only tax evasion; it's just like banking leniencies.
one way to put it.
That's very, very charitable.
I think okay. So I want to talk a little bit about like why the meta's changed. For example, what the meta changing says about this, because obviously like this channel is a lot about like the rising inequality, and I think that obviously like tax evasion is not an industry for most people, right? Tax evasion and high-end tourism is also included in all of these places. These places do like both things. They do high-end tourism and tax evasion simultaneously. Obviously, like places like Ireland, Switzerland, and Norway are not that. Norway's not that at all.
No, Ireland is just like the European corporate tax, not evasion, but lower tax safe haven.
Tax haven, yeah.
Exactly, tax haven. And more than tax evasion, it's tax haven.
Exactly.
Right? That's the
but corporate
the true
more than
nomenclature. But yeah, like oil made sense as the meta because everyone needs energy to like survive and like to like grow an economy. But I guess like not everyone needs financial services to like in their day-to-day lives. But it's interesting that these countries are like the richest, and in my opinion, it kind of shows that like the rising wealth of like the richest in the world has made these countries that are obviously very small, because it wouldn't really like go as far if the United States as a whole was a tax haven, like it wouldn't be distributed as much between the citizens of the country. And so I think that it's interesting that today the countries that succeeded the most have been tailoring their like industries towards the wealthier people. And it's something that we were talking here like off camera a little bit about like the real estate market in Madrid, which is that rich, wealthy international people outbid internationally poor Spanish people, right? Like purchasing power parity, like life in Spain is not terrible, but Spanish people have a lot less money than international, like Americans or other richer Europeans, and they all want to come here. You go to Mallorca, it's filled with Germans.
Canary Islands also filled with like German, English.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so basically the entire country of Spain is getting gentrified a little bit, and honestly,
well, here in Madrid you've got the kind of like the rich Latin Americans where we don't really know where their money comes from, but they like outbid or like overbid to purchase flats in like the center of Madrid, but like overbid by a lot. And if you are the Spanish grandma that has had that place for like 100 years, 50, has been on your family forever, and they are offering you 100 twice the amount of what it's actually worth, then of course you're gonna say yes and go for it. But then that place is kind of locked out.
Yeah, for the people that are Spanish. But the reason I wanted to do this is because I hoped that in studying the richest nations in the world, there would be like a strategy that most other countries could follow to like produce the same wealth, but it kind of is impossible to everyone. Like you can't have everyone be a tax haven. That's like, honestly, that's not really a possible thing that countries can do. Like if everyone was a tax haven, all these countries' economy would fall to the ground because they would offer no services other than tourism. Obviously, Switzerland is a big exception, and I really want to talk about Switzerland because like the argument that Piketty makes is that like, oh, like there's a low inequality comes from like large taxes on the rich and progressive taxes, but Switzerland has like almost no, like very, very few taxes. Like Switzerland's like top marginal income is like 12-13%, which is super low. Like it's even really, it's like America is thought about this country that has no taxes, but Switzerland is like no taxes. But obviously it doesn't take away like a lot of taxes from the poorer people, and it doesn't really have, and it's it's low tax, but it's progressive in its low taxness. So I think Switzerland is an interesting country to talk about in the sense that it's different. Ireland, like, to what extent can we say has been successful? Like, for a lot of people, it's been really good, but for other people, there's like studies that like 41% of adults between 18 and 35 like still live at home with their parents, and that like almost 70% of 25-year-olds live at home still. And
Well, and
obviously,
if you think, for example, from my Irish friends in London, they always say that if you think the London housing market is bad, you should look at Dublin. Apparently, it's even worse.
yeah.
So that also tells you about, like, it's not working for actually the people that live there, right?
Yeah. Like, obviously, like, housing, like, as a market has the two issues of like supply or demand, and I think that both work to make housing unaffordable. In places like the US, like NIMBYism, like not in my neighborhood kind of stuff, is like limiting to building like large multifamily housing.
Well, you can't use the acronym NIMBY and then just say not in my neighbor. It's not in my backyard.
Not in my backyard,
Please,
sorry.
come on. If we're gonna use
Please,
acronyms, use
sorry.
it correct.
Let's use them right.
You have to say exactly. I feel like the idea was there.
But I feel
Alas.
like coming back to the main question that you said at the beginning of why nations fail, right? I think that housing, like, if I would be addressing that question today, you have like topics that come to mind on like success and failure of like immigration, and housing is in that mix, right? And I think that when we relate that to Piketty's book, and he talks a lot about, well, capital is like kind of like the main thing of the book, and although he includes real estate assets in capital, which I think you mentioned as a Moglu, he criticizes that shouldn't be part of capita, that should be part of wealth. But anyways, I think that housing and how we see across rich European countries, how there is a housing crisis in every major city. Even in Madrid, you're looking at it nowadays, how we are maybe not there yet, but definitely heading in that way.
I mean, housing prices like augmented 20% in a year.
Exactly.
That's crazy.
And I think that's a symptom of the failure that it's coming, right? Which is already being lived on places like in London. Right?
I saw an interview with Gavin Newsom and like this YouTuber called Atriarch, and he's like this Gen Z millennial like guy that used to be like a gamer marketer for like Nvidia and Twitch, but he like did some Twitch streaming for gaming, but he's become more economics focused recently. And he basically told like Gavin Newsom like radicalism is when no house, and it's a bit simplistic to say when no house it's radicalist, but if like Keir, you've spoken a lot about this, but it's like obviously like the people that are interested in the system continuing are the people that have stuff to lose, right? If you have nothing to lose, then you don't give a shit if the system is destroyed from like an individual self-interest perspective.
There was I think there was a quote from maybe it was a book. I don't remember the origin, but something like, the only difference between like stability, I'm paraphrasing a bit, the only difference between stability and anarchy is 9 meals. If you go 3 days, if the average person goes 3 days in a row without eating, that's the sign that like all hell is going to break loose. Because at that point, it's either do or die, quite literally.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I agree with the sentiment. Radicalism is when no house. And no meal.
Well, yeah, exactly. It's like the basic necessities to survive. And it's like, well, you don't technically need housing to survive, but you need it for like social prestige, right? If you're homeless, it's viewed very, very negatively. Even if you're getting food from the government, even if you're like surviving, like you're not living, you're not like doing like what you were told that life was gonna be like when you were a kid. And so like if you saw that your parents were able to buy like a 2-story house and you can barely afford like a 1-bedroom apartment, like that you pay between 2 people, then like obviously this is gonna be something that makes you think that stuff is more unfair these days. And in a lot of ways it's true. Like the cost of living has gone through the roof. Like our access to things that used to be considered luxuries has like raised a lot, right? Like fancy clothes or like stuff that would have been like even like some military domestics like are a lot more like purchasable these days that weren't as much like 100 years ago or at all. But like the things that we took for granted or like certain countries took for granted, like housing, like it's no longer like a thing that is guaranteed to you.
But that's then I would ask you the question, is capitalism, for example, doomed to create ever rising inequality? Like, if you were Piketty, you would say like, you'd say yes, and but I think that in his book, then he would say that policy and institutions are kind of the solution. That's where I can disagree a bit with that. I agree with other authors that say that actually our current policies and institutions kind of like help boost that kind of like capitalism creates ever rising inequality. But I think that what you were saying of like the cost of living is rising, with the discussion we had on the housing crisis, then is capitalism. What do we need for capitalism to stop creating this rising inequality, which it's creating kind of these failures in nations?
I think I kind of like how you brought that up, because it felt a lot like what Piketty said in his book about Marx's thought on the capital system, that it can only work in theory if it continually keeps expanding production forever, which, I mean, it's impossible in reality.
Well, it's possible because if you read like capitalist like discourse, it's possible in the sense that the ideas can grow infinitely in value, and so like you can technically grow infinitely if it's just like non-physical like a non-competitive goods, right? Like we can both watch the same movie on a screen, but we both can't eat the same apple, right?
Yeah.
You can create infinite movies technically, right? Like obviously they still have to have some physical space and data storage somewhere, but as we get better at storing data, we can reach infinitum, like not actual infinity, but like basically.
But I think that's maybe what, I don't know if Marx was saying.
But obviously, it is true of
yeah.
like land, housing, and unless all our buildings end up being like a kilometer tall and cover every single blade of grass in the world, then yeah, obviously like housing and food and like physical goods are limited. Like that is beyond the shadow of a doubt true. But obviously, you can have infinite accumulation through ideas and stuff like that. But I wanted to talk about it what things like make it so that there's no inequality. And obviously like a progressive tax system is one of those, right? If you limit how rich the rich can be and like promote the poor to like and take less money from the poor, then obviously that's going to be some distributive thing that's going to make there be less inequality. But I think the case of Switzerland is really, really interesting because they are basically full capitalist and they don't have like nearly as much inequality as the US. Like their Gini coefficient is like 0.31 and the US is like 0.42 or 0.48 depending who you ask, right? And so like why is Switzerland that has a much less progressive tax than the US? Like if you just look at the federal tax, like why are they like a less unequal country? And my conclusion to this has been that it's access to education, because in like capitalism and production, you basically have you have capital, which is like resources, you have like labor, which is like your time and effort, but obviously you have know-how, and know-how is like crucially important. And a lot of like I saw like a Ricardo Hausmann criticism of Piketty that said that Piketty didn't focus enough on the difference in know-how of different countries, and I completely agree. I don't think that Hausmann at all took away the argument of like rising inequality. I don't think he even like attacked that at all, but he said that like the model and understanding of the economy failed because he didn't take into account know-how. And in a place like Switzerland, education is paid mostly by the state, and even though they don't have free universities, they're like 500 Swiss francs a year to 4,000, right? So it's much more affordable than the US, where like the US can cost you 70K plus a year in the top universities, and you basically have to go to the top universities in a lot of places. But there's also like there's inequality in access to education itself in the US. And because of that, the know-how is unequal in itself, and it creates more and more inequality. So that's my explanation for why Switzerland is like economy, like I was saying that it's a lot like appeals to the rich. Obviously, like we connected to high-end banking and like lax banking. We connected to like high-end tourism and production of luxury goods like watches, like Rolex, Tagure, is that French? I don't know.
Swarovski.
But they have a lot of luxury brands, but they also have a lot of like pharmaceutical and industrial and service sectors that are really, really strong, right? It's not just these like rich facing like industries, but they have they have wide access to education. And I think that that's like a really important thing for like inequality decreasing.
But that's what kind of like. I'm not really. I don't have a lot of knowledge on the Swiss kind of like system. But if I take what you're saying, right, on like the education of like in Switzerland, then you cover one part in, let's say, the labor market of like how the demand or like the supply of workers are like very high quality educated workers, but then how do you like, are there enough companies, let's say in Switzerland? Because the problem that you have nowadays, for example, in the UK, there was a study by the OECD that the UK is a place where you have the largest amount of overqualified workers.
Mm.
So if you would go and get a job in London, right, there is a high probability that you are overqualified for what you're doing and you're not actually getting paid the amount of what your credentials are. What's avoiding that from happening in Switzerland, right? When you have such an educated workforce, how come they are not like being overqualified and underpaid because they are overqualified?
Well, in this sense, like obviously I don't understand, like this is the difficult thing about talking about general inequalities in a worldwide scale, because it requires so much like intricate knowledge of basically every system that exists in the world, which is, you know, obviously no one person can truly have all this knowledge. It's like beyond one person's capacity for understanding. My argument would be that I think that maybe I'm wrong, but like, what's your perspective of like, obviously the UK has like amazing top rated universities at the high end, but would you say that like there's variance in the quality of all public universities? Do you think that it's because my perspective with Switzerland, or at least like my instinct would be that theirs is much more like wide reaching to all the population, and that is just so happens to be that they have like these, that they are like really really skilled, but also they're supported by the rich, like by the rich industries, right? They have the support of banking, and they have the support of like rich tourism. So a lot of people with a lot of money come from outside the country to put money into the Swiss system. So
well, the problem in
that's
the
a benefit
UK,
that the UK might not have.
Yeah. Well, no, the problem in the UK right now is that if you were to ask that question 10 years ago, like before Brexit, maybe the answer would be different. But nowadays, if you look in the Financial Times and you put in the search bar like UK universities, all the headlines are gonna be how 75% of them are going bankrupt in like 5 years or 10 years or whatever the timeline is, as a consequence of Brexit, a changing. You don't have the European students, the quantity of European students that used to go to the UK. Now they have to open the market to like international students, which sometimes means lowering your standards, and overall that has impacted like the quality of education. Maybe not for the Oxbridge, LSE, UCL, kind of like these top tier universities, but definitely for the middle and lower tier are being like heavily impacted. So my answer would be like, you're in the next few years you're gonna see a complete change on like I think a lot of people nowadays in the UK are opting not to go to university because of the overqualification, because of how the quality of education is not really improving. So
yeah, there was a few weeks ago they announced the first kind of super university, because two universities that are on risk of going bankrupt were merged together to try and make it kind of financially in the black. And I think now, as you mentioned, there's going to be a lot of restructuring. There's talks of like the tuition fees that were already in some senses expensive, but in other senses very affordable, because anybody can apply to unis in the UK and the government will pay for the tuition and then you repay it back over time. But at the current rate of £9,000 per year, it's...
Well, and it's already, the thing is that there's already the precedent, right? You had, before it was 3,000, then I think it went to 6,000.
No, it went straight to 9,000.
Oh, it went straight to, from 3,000, it went straight to 9,000. And if it goes even higher, then the loan that the government gives you is going to be like, the value of the loan is going to be less, right? Because before you took the loan, paid your tuition, and you could use a part of it also for like your living, right? For your dorm, for your day-to-day living and expenses. Nowadays, what you're gonna use all the loan for the tuition, and then but then if you increase the amount of the loan, then more people are gonna be more indebted, and it's gonna create that kind of like loop in a system like, well, in the US, I think the percentage of people that are not paying their student loans increased by a lot recently.
In general, I've seen like fraud and like credit cards and stuff like that rise. I wouldn't be surprised if student loans is included in that. And in general, yeah, like the US especially, like consider the case of like rising unemployment for recent graduates, right? In the US specifically.
But that's why, and going back to Switzerland, now that I never thought about it, but now that you brought it up, it's interesting to think like, what are they doing right or differently?
My perspective with Switzerland is that I just think that they're very intelligent, capable, and patient in their system. Like, if you want to talk about a system that has been like pretty like unchanging, like in the European sense, like Switzerland is one of the most like steady, right? You could say in a sense. Like sometimes I wonder that what is like whether or not there are optimal strategies. The optimal strategy is almost never one government does the opposite of the opposite government, because then you don't have like even one plan that keeps going for a long time, right? It's like if you have someone that's like super socialist for 4 years and then super capitalist for 4 years, then you're like the system, just the expense that has to be done in changing your strategy is like unideal, right? Whilst like if you already have a system that it's like unchanging, whether or not it's good, like people don't have to spend more money like retooling themselves. I was speaking to Venezuelan friends of mine. They were saying like before the election, like some of them, they obviously would yearn for freedom and stuff like that, but they were like, oh my God, the economy was doing so much better before the election because like everyone knew what was happening. We knew that these were the ground rules. We accepted that these were the ground rules. And you could just like, as long as you know what to expect, you can work within the system. Is it a corrupt system where you have to basically bribe the government whenever? Yes. But people know how to work within the system. And so like you can, when it's predictable, you can work within the system. And I think that a lot of European systems are changing so fast, especially like the UK with Brexit and like the swings in parties that are popular, that I think like the system, there's too many changes that like the cost of changing itself.
Yeah, that there is no space for consolidation.
Mm-hmm.
There's just like a ever like changing environment, but there's no consolidation of ideas, there's no consolidation of institutions, because the next guy that comes kind of like undoes the work of the other, starts doing their own work, but then at that time another one comes, starts undoing his work, doing his own. Mm-hmm. So there's like, definitely I agree that there's like no consolidation of what's the approach. So the Labour government in the UK has, I think, already a year in government or more, I don't know. But 2 years ago in the UK, in immigration, we were talking about sending people to Rwanda to deport them. And nowadays, the policy, thank God, has changed completely, right? But none of the ideas are consolidating. And if the Labour government is not able to stay in power, then probably reform will come in, and it won't be Rwanda, it will be Madagascar, something different.
But they'll send them to like a humane location this time, like the Marianas Trench or Mars, I don't know.
But what I'm trying to say is, which is something that you brought up, is kind of like the influence of politics, how institutions and policy either consolidate or like make inequality continue rising, or they introduce a tax system that tries to like not fight inequality but trying to cope with it, or trying to so the influence of not only like the economic system but also like the policies and the institutions.
I was thinking it might be a bit cynical, but from what I've heard of Switzerland, it's hard to live there if you don't have money to begin with, because it's high cost of living. At least in Geneva. I don't know about like.
I've seen that. Yeah, the cities are really high cost of living. That's true.
So I'm thinking, is there a possibility that Switzerland has kind of a lower like score of inequality, say Gini coefficient, just because like you can't entertain the thought of living there if you're like dirt poor?
Yeah, but is it you're saying like because it's not like they're not in the EU, so you can't be a
but
citizen of another country. If you like,
It's
if you start Swiss, I guess like you can just apply for
They're
work.
half into the EU.
Yeah, it's like I guess like it wouldn't be the most difficult thing for a Swiss to get like EU citizenship or like residence because they're probably very educated people.
But I mean, the barriers. I agree. Like maybe the barriers to enter like the Swiss system or society, let's say in general, are so high or higher relative to the other kind of like rich European countries that there is no like you don't ever. I don't think about moving to Switzerland, because it is a huge cost, and I don't know how the immigration laws are in Switzerland, but I guess that
I think they're difficult.
Not very friendly for you to get a passport like here in Spain that you can come from any Latin American country.
Basically, it's
get
confirmed.
Asylum, and in 2 years you have papers to work and do anything, and in 5 you already have kind of like the nationality or the residence, or I don't think the Swiss system is as...
Yeah, I think that it's definitely more difficult for immigration, for sure, like from what I've seen.
I think that brings up another question that is like, is the Swiss success because they work kind of like for their people, you know what I mean? So they're not focused on like, they're focused on like working for the Swiss, right? So like on making the education and the barriers to become Swiss maybe are very high for you to access those benefits that have made them a success, while in other rich European countries, and we've talked on housing, this is more like on the migration issue.
Yeah, the EU has felt the need to like subsidize the lives of refugees coming into like, and I agree that there's a moral imperative to do it, but obviously like it's gonna be a weight on the economy. Like there's no other way.
But it's also that kind of like new image, well not image, but kind of like the new approach of the EU of like steering away from being a purely economic kind of like technocratic union into more like what's called a social Europe, right? And I think that within that concept of like social Europe, beyond welfare and all of that, is kind of like that kind of empathy, like global empathy, let's say. Like
the global empathy is that's drastically reducing.
Oh yeah, definitely.
But I think like the concept of immigration is difficult, right? Like it's very different place to place, right? If you're a illegal immigrant in the U.S., you have no benefits except whatever you get paid, right? So it's like, in that sense, like it's self-selecting for people that are really, really, really hard workers. In Europe, you have more benefits. So like perhaps the people that aren't as like hard workers, and they're probably not as educated because they come from countries with worse education systems. And so like this is the tricky thing about like this like immigration that you're doing is that you're putting people that have like less skills, and maybe they're in an age where they can't really reskill as easily as if they were younger. And obviously like if they can't pay more in taxes than what they're being like giving in benefits, which obviously like every European citizen gets a lot of benefits, at least compared to countries like the US, or with the exception of perhaps a few. But from my understanding is that like in the world, like these are like some of the people that get the most benefits from the government. And in some cases, like maybe some of these migrants aren't actually paying in as much as like they are receiving. And I'm not saying that like it's like that it's like completely wrong. Obviously there's a moral value to saving these people from poverty and starvation or war, especially war, I think. Like you can't really live in Gaza at all these days, and other places that have been bombed to hell. So in that sense, there is a moral argument, but you have to be realistic about the cost, and whether it's worth the cost to do something that's right. That something has to be analyzed, but you have to look at the cost, right? Yeah, I think that you can go against. So perhaps Switzerland, because they probably only allow people that are like really, really talented, like have had a little bit more success with this. I was very surprised when I was researching that Switzerland doesn't have like a minimum wage. Like some, like maybe like in Sweden, like you have it based on like what do you guys like job, like profession, right?
Oh,
and there are
union or guild standard.
Yeah, or like guilds, and then there's like some collective like labor agreements in Switzerland.
In Switzerland.
Yeah, yeah. But it's like, it doesn't cover everyone, right? And so I don't know. It's an interesting thing, and I think that perhaps closing the doors. I think another thing we have to talk about when it's like, oh, why is inequality not rising? Is that in some ways it is, and it's being reflected like in the like birth rate. right? So like the birth rate in Switzerland is like 1.33, right? Which is far from the replacement rate of 2.1 that needs to happen. And it's not as low as in Spain, it's not as low as in other European countries, but it's still like dramatically lower because you don't have as much purchasing power. So like perhaps and the only reason the inequality isn't rising is because we're just producing less people to be poor, right? Because the poor are just not having as many children. So maybe in that sense, like, like if the population pyramid was like looking like a pyramid, then like maybe the inequality would be a lot higher. But obviously, like there's been a counter reaction in the entire Western world and in all developed countries, even like developing countries like China, where like populations have been decreasing like rapidly. And in that sense, that means that there's going to be less people spending money, but there's obviously like more space for you in the future. And yeah, who knows? Like I have to. This is like the thing that I mentioned earlier. Like there's very like institutions matter. That's another thing that I recently read an economic like book that's called like The Great Escape, but in Spanish like La Nación, which is like basically like a political economy intro book to economics, and they really talk about like this. Fuck, what was I going with this?
Don't look at me, man.
Where was I going with this? Oh my god, I just completely like blanked.
No, but
pivot.
While you try to remember what you were gonna say, what I was thinking when you were talking about Switzerland, and I was thinking of other countries, and even nowadays, is you mentioned the labor unions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned Sweden, where labor unions are very strong. I don't know how strong are they in Switzerland, but in general, with this whole like, well, the rebirth, if we can call it right, like that, of neoliberalism with no regulations, free markets or whatever. But actually, if you look, there is a few studies I had in this course about politics of inequality that I was telling you about back in my master's, that where in rich European countries where labor unions are weak, right, you see higher inequality because workers' rights are not protected. So I think that's something else to be taken into account. But at the same time, where I was going with this is that the argument is like, yeah, but the problem is that labor unions are going to impact negatively economic growth, right? Because you don't have a free market or like, and all of that. But I don't believe, and there's many people that believe that economic growth and equality are kind of like mutually exclusive, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what the answer is to get both. I think there should be an answer to get both, but I don't know what your thoughts, because I think that's a huge factor on making today's nations not fail, right? Find that kind of like continue economic growth, but try to level the playing field.
Well, it is interesting. Like if you like look at like global GDP, it's been like it was at its strongest when taxes were at their highest, right? So like during the 1950s and 60s, like world GDP was like 5% a year, right? Especially like.
But the problem I have with that reference is that you're talking kind of like the golden era, the golden age.
Well, yeah, but like
right?
the question
and
is
you're
like
talking about there is the four horsemen of Scheidel, I think is the author, right? And he mainly makes a political argument to that kind of like golden era of like wartime trauma reshaping the way in which we see like politics and economics to more like solidarity, higher taxes. So for example, in Sweden, I think one of the examples he puts, I think is in that book, he mentions how in Sweden, before World War II and before the wars, there was basically no tax at all, or taxes were really low.
In most of the world, that was true.
And after the wars and the whole like wartime and the destruction, you see kind of like politics and economics having a complete change. And Sweden, for continuing with that example, now having one of the strongest kind of like labor unions of the time, way higher taxes, right? So when we talk about the 1950s, 60s, I think we have to put that asterisk of like how the world completely changed.
Well, yeah, but that's what I'm saying. Like the change itself was like the unprecedented like rise in like taxes, I think, right?
But no,
like,
but the
through
change
solidarity.
but the actual change is the level of destruction that the war brought that actually allowed for that change to happen.
Well, yeah,
right.
The problem with that, I mean, I haven't read this work, but the problem with at least how I'm understanding it, you're saying these changes came about because of wartime destruction, but Sweden wasn't necessarily like ravaged by the Second World War. So how does it?
I don't think that it wasn't ravaged, but it was definitely impacted, right?
Yeah, obviously, all economies are probably.
It wasn't neutral, but it wasn't also like fighting.
But definitely, but I think that it had an impact across all of Europe. It's undeniable, right? Or like maybe the changes that were happening in places that were that faced the most like kind of destruction also had an impact across all of like continental Europe. All that I'm saying is that the argument the Four Horsemen makes is that he says that actually institutions and policy, although they matter, they actually just benefit kind of like capitalism, and the only thing that is kind of like apocalyptic kind of like
I'm smiling because institutions and policy institutions was exactly what I wanted to talk about. That I forgot.
But he says that that actually the only things that can bring about the change that you could argue we need nowadays is kind of like not, I don't want to call it destruction, but kind of like very big events that change the paradigm of how we look at things, right?
But yeah,
but institutions definitely matter, and I think he agrees with that.
My argument is a chicken or the egg thing. Like, do we actually need the destruction itself, or do we need the radical change that comes as a reaction to destruction, right? Because like, you can technically have radical change without violence, right? Like, if I was like a dictator and I could change the laws at my whim, I could change everything in a day, right? Like I could change like the institutions themselves in a day if I was a dictator, kind of thing.
But sorry that I interrupted. When he says, because the Four Horsemen refers to, I can't name the four events that he mentions. One is like war. Another one I think is like revolution. Another one I think he mentions like pandemics or something like that.
If it's based on the Four Horsemen, it's war, death.
Oh, famine probably.
Exactly. But it's based on that, but I think he mentions like specific events that could, but yeah, go on. I just wanted to clarify that.
But yeah, but my instinct would be that like, obviously if you like redistribute money to the poor in society, that these people will have more wants and more ability to purchase things. And my instinct is that this generally leads to growth, because it means that these people, like how much wants you have don't scale linearly, right? They scale like the rate of wants like slows down the richer you get, right? Because A, like you can't have everything, and B, you don't have infinite time to enjoy everything, right? You can't consume infinite services as a person. You don't have infinite time. You're gonna die one day, and so you simply can't consume everything. So what this means is that if you give more money to poor people, they will spend more of it, and like the economy will grow, at least like in the short term, right? There's obviously the saving for growth in the future argument versus the like spending right now. But the truth is that if you give someone, like if you gave a guy in minimum wage like $500, and they would probably spend at least half of that, right? Almost certainly, right? I mean, it depends how they're like in their own situation, but they would tend to spend more. If you gave Elon Musk $500, he's not spending a dime of that, right? It's like that is absolutely no money for him. And so what this indicates is that like there is more consumption if you distribute money towards the people that are less wealthy. And so I think that generally that means that you're going to get more growth. Now, is that growth always desirable? Because I think that generally there has to be a question about like to what extent growth is desirable. And obviously I think in terms of quality of life, it's always desirable. But like the New Deal did produce a lot of negative externalities, like producing like pollution and stuff like that, which then had to be like taken care of. Obviously, like it made the purchasing power of people a lot better and made them a lot wealthier. So that's obviously a net good. But you have to deal with this other negative externality of like, oh well, we grew so much that we started to like devour the resources of our planet, right? Or like squander or like use them poorly. And so in that sense, I think that economic growth is directly tied to like the ability of like people to consume, and in that sense I think that these very high taxes will lead to that in general.
High taxes on high
like progressive taxes, right? Like obviously not high taxes like in the case of Spain, where like if you make 20K a year you pay 50% to the government basically. That's obviously kind of too high, bro.
You don't pay 50.
Bro, you pay like 23, your employer pays 23% for you, and then you pay like 18%. and then you have 20% VAT. So it does kind of go to like 30 to 50 range. Let me tell you.
Well, yeah,
The thing is, like,
there's a difference
the thing
between
is you
saying
don't know
I
it
pay
because
50% outright and then you pay an aggregate 50%.
But yeah, so I'm saying like
spread out.
the government takes 50% of what you're worth basically. How it does it is different, but it's like it's more like 40 to be fair. But it's like excised, right? In the case of like Switzerland, it's like 5% or like 10% because of like a 6% VAT. You have like a 19% VAT in Spain for non-food goods, but regardless, yeah, obviously I mean like a progressive tax system where like the rich are taxed a lot higher than the poor. And so yeah, I think that would naturally tend towards growth because just of the purchase, like the tendency for people to have less to purchase more. That's my belief there.
But
like, is that a desirable thing? That's a question.
But
that's a
then
good
what I'm
question,
struggling because I like how you said like the meta, right?
The meta.
What I'm struggling to like make sense of is what you asked of like then what is the meta nowadays, right?
Well, the meta is tax havens, as we know.
Well, tax havens, but then if we are seeing how I don't want to say that nations are going to fail, right?
Yeah.
But kind of like flipping the questions of like how can we make them succeed? What would be the meta for them to succeed, right?
This is the
now
thing,
that
right?
we know the meta that is arguably making them fail.
Yeah, this is my opinion, right? And my opinion is that these very high progressive taxes are net good. The problem is that it's a collective action issue. The problem is that you have to have basically most, if not all, countries agree to it, right? Because like there is a certain, if you want to say like mercenary or like capital or class that like can move wherever they want, and these people have the most capital and the most know-how in the world, so they're the best for making countries succeed. If you raise taxes too much on them, they could leave, and in many cases they do. Like obviously, like it depends how much they they identify with their own country, right? Like if they completely see themselves as American, they can only see themselves in the US, then they're gonna stay in the US. But if they see themselves as a citizen of the world, like I myself am kind of like this kind of person, right? I've lived in 3 different countries. I see myself as an international person. Obviously, I'm happy to like pay whatever taxes like country takes to me because this is my belief that high taxes are good. But the problem is that if you do high taxes and other countries and basically no one else does, then almost all top tier talent and most capital is going to leave you, like dynamic capital, because those are like different types of capital. There's capital like land that you can't move land, but you can't move factories easily, but you can move ideas, you can move currency in our liberal world, right? And Reagan, basically, like what was happening with like when Reagan came into the world and neoliberalism really powered up is that before Reagan, like capital transfers and talent transfers were much harder because transportation costs were much higher. There wasn't digitalization for transfer of, or there was much less digitalization for transfer of capital and talent and ideas. So nowadays, because we're so mobile, like people can just escape immediately to a different country. And so I think that the meta is unfortunately very difficult because like it depends on all other countries doing the same thing. It's difficult because it's a working together strategy rather than an individual strategy.
But that's where if some percentual points in taxes are what it's gonna make it do or die, let's say in that very drastic sense, to your country, because if you move a few percentages more higher, right, all the capital is gonna move and you're gonna have brain drain, then kind of like there is a fragility to your nation that is like there's no commitment to the collective, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I would like to say I think with brain drain it's more about like the workforce and it's not necessarily about
talent.
tax.
Okay.
Well, talent, but it's more about opportunities within the country.
Okay.
Because, like for example, Spain, like as I know Spain, I am a Spaniard after all, with a very weird foreign name. We have brain drain not because we have high taxes, although some people would argue that it's more about like Unai, for example, our friend. He studies medicine, high skilled profession, but here simply like salary is not.
Yeah,
feasible.
salary for a doctor is miserable
So
in Spain.
of course, for him, the only logical choice is either like become a starving doctor here. It sounds weird, or just move abroad and make.
Yeah, the argument that many capitalists would make is that it's because like
Yeah, I was gonna make
it's
that
so
argument.
much taxes in Spain.
I'm not a capitalist.
Yeah, but then,
But the argument is that the lack of opportunities is precisely because of like basically a regressive tax scheme in many ways. Not regressive, but like not progressive enough tax scheme in Spain, in the sense that everyone pays a lot of taxes in Spain, like every single human, like every single person here. And basically, like the government is just less good than the free market at producing value. And that's an argument that I actually want to have next week with a friend that we both have in common. And we're going to have that debate about state versus free market. But let's take it for granted right now that the free market is better. And I truly believe that, but I want to have a different argument a different day. That is better making, like people say that the lack of opportunities in Spain is precisely because of that. And yeah, that's why we have like less value here. But it's true that obviously it has to do with less value. But yeah, it's like I think that it depends completely on the individual. And I think that a country like the United States is really, really pluralistic, which means that it naturally has a less strong national identity, right? The US doesn't really like the US's entire identity is really success, right? Because apart from that, it has like this like black culture that comes from being like slaves. It has this white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture. It has this immigrant culture from all the Italians, all the Irish, all the Chinese, all the Japanese, like every single like everyone from the
Yeah,
world.
it's a whole like
Latino.
manifested destiny is the concept.
no, that's different.
Well,
No, no, I know that has to do with the whole like westward movement, but if you were to extrapolate that to nowadays, it's
like the
to
principle of exceptionism.
that,
It's
and
like
the principle of like we have to succeed and we have to. I know it's taken from a different time, but it's kind of like going to how does that translate to today,
like
right?
if I think it's a country like purely held together by success, right? Like if they become unsuccessful, their national identity starts to break up really quickly because they don't have like as much cultural cohesion as other nations. That's my perspective there, at least. And so, like, I think that Americans themselves, because they're so international or like so like politically like diverse, they feel less sense of country in that way. Maybe not the Anglo-Saxon Protestants; they're like the most American Americans. But like, other than that, like, I think people that don't feel strong connection to the place that they're in are the most likely to leave for greener pastures elsewhere. And I think in general, like. My idea is I think that a lot of the problems with the world require international cooperation, and that's what I would think that at the very least we should have. I don't need the states to be too strong, right? I just need to have like, so in the sense that there's not like economic imbalances completely within the world where like one country has all the tourism, other countries have all the intelligence, like all the service, like all the bankers, right? There has to be like more stability within that so that spaces themselves are more self-sufficient. Right, and don't depend on like wild swings in the prices of specific markets or specific things. I want to start wrapping up because we were already in the 53-minute mark, and it's been a really interesting conversation. But I don't know, like, do you have like a final conclusions that you want to state given the conversation?
I think with a fun kind of exercise at the beginning, I don't know if it's exactly relevant, but it kind of reminds me of a similar exercise someone did to me years ago, but on like environmental issues. They said, "Do you know which two countries in the world produce the least like CO2 emissions per capita?" And I was like, "Oh, I don't know." I was throwing out answers there. They said, "No, it's China and Mongolia." I was like, "That's not exactly." And they said, "Oh, we should really emulate them." I was like, "No, it's because per capita."
They got
China,
1.5 million.
China, like obviously, is diluting entirely how much emissions they produce per capita. If you just say gross, obviously they're at the top. And then Mongolia, I mean, come on, that's like a statistical anomaly. It's like a country mainly known for just being agricultural horse breeders and have a really small population. So when you said like, should we measure success by?
Yeah,
I don't mean you said we should. I'm just saying. Like if we measure it by per capita, it's really misleading because like Isle of Man, it's tiny, it's a tax haven.
But yeah, that's what I mean. Like I think per capita, again, there's a difference between like the average and the median, and it has to do completely with distributions, right? But I think like what I kind of wanted to show with this exercise was that basically these are not sustainable solutions, like even like for the entire world, right? Like by their very nation, not everyone can be a tax haven. And so what I kind of want to show is that we currently live in a kind of fucked up system in the sense that the reward is not really producing things that are made for most people. The reward is producing things that are made exclusively for the richest. And I think per capita is a good measure. The problem is that you also have to think about, like, in the sense of like how powerful a country is by its size, but obviously you have to take into account distribution, right? Because if there's a million people and then one person has $10 trillion, it's like everyone's gonna be like a millionaire. But obviously like that's not that's not exactly like an ideal situation.
Maybe
I don't
like
think.
It'll be interesting to see like countries by GDP per capita, and then also like filtered by, say, I don't know, like
median, yeah.
So like
salary.
filter. So at both times they're being filtered by GDP, and then something like HDI, just to see like what would the re-ranking look like then.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm just throwing it out.
But just to be clear, my intention was not to say that what these countries are doing is the best thing for the world, but
No, but it's
not that
definitely definitely a mirror image of what things have become, right?
yeah, exactly. It's like this is like a really clear way to say that, that's the meta right now. Appeal to the rich, sell to the rich. Well, in the US, like 50% of consumption is from the top 10%. So shows you a little bit of like our economies depend on these days. But yeah, do you wanna have some final thoughts?
I'd say my final thought is kind of like this conversation is also like beyond this exercise, the conversation as a whole, I think is where kind of the world stands right now, that we can't really make a sense or find a solution of how to get that growth and how to achieve not equality, but how to like reduce inequality. And because systems are different, you have to tailor it to each country, but at the same time you want to make it so that other countries can use it at their benefit. So I think that we are in that kind of like transition time, let's call it, or I don't know, where we're trying to discover that solution.
Yeah. And to be clear with like the solution that I said of like, having these progressive tax systems, it's like, it's really trade-offs, right? Because if you do this tax system, then you'll likely like, maybe you'll lose like some like growth in GDP, but like most people will be doing better in your country, right? So it's a trade-off, right? It's like, if all your like, if your country like degrows by 1%, but like the lower 50% is like twice as rich, then it's like, are we really a worse country, right? Kind of thing. And it's like, obviously you have to take into consideration a lot of things, and it's all trade-offs. There is, this is the central economic issue. You have to figure out who gets what, because there's not infinite things. The scarcity is not, it's not like there's not enough going around, but there is no such thing as infinite resources, as you mentioned, especially like things that we consume, that we eat, that we sleep in. So yeah, I think this is a great chat. Thank you both of you for joining me.
Invite.
No, it's me here, and we'll see you in the next episode. Peace.